Okay, episode 13 of the SumerSports Show. We're live, and it's a Monday. It's our second Monday episode. I'm Eric Eager. I'm VP of Research and Development at SumerSports. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff, the CEO of SumerSports. And first off, Thomas, where are you right now? Are you? What part of the country are you in? And because last time I know somebody commented on how awesome your backdrop looked when you were in Atlanta, and now you're in a different part of the country.
I am. I'm actually back in Boulder for a few days before Christmas. I wanted to bring my kids out here, kind of work from here. I honestly get a lot of work done here in Boulder because I love my mountain home here and our mountain home here. So it's good. I'm out here for about 5 days, and then I'll just jet set back to Atlanta and be there, for the rest of the year. But I will say this: I do have a little bit of where is Waldo element to me, which I'm not real happy. Most of my buddies are like, "Man, where in the hell are you today?" I mean. It's just life right now, I guess.
I know. And it's funny because like I've had a similar sort of experience this year because I had planned so many trips back when I was still with PFF. And then, obviously with Sumer, you guys were so gracious to let me still take them. So I've been to, Lincoln and, Provo, Utah. And then last week I was at the Army Navy game in Philadelphia. It's been fun. It usually don't, as folks know, you normally don't get to, travel around the country this time of year other than for games. But it's cool. Obviously, you get to travel across the country and have a little trip with your kids. And then, or they're not even kids anymore. Like they're a little older, than mine are. But yeah, it's so cool. Like during the season to get to an opportunity to do that and to spend some time. I'll be in Minnesota this week. I'll actually be at the Vikings-Giants game. I grew up in Minnesota. I had the distinction. I went to the last ever game at the Metrodome in 2013. It was a Vikes-Lions game, which, by the way, we have to talk. My friend here, Dave Solfaro's into the chat. A big-time Lions fan, really happy. Frazier here, restore the roar. The Lions went over their betting win total this week, Thomas, which is really fun. I went to the last ever game at the Metrodome, and then in 2015 when they were playing in the Gopher Stadium, I wanted to go to the last ever game there. But then they made the playoffs that year and played against Seattle in that cold game where they missed a field goal. But I have never been to that new stadium, the US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis. So that ought to be fun. Get to see Kwesi and get to see some the Vikings fresh off of the biggest comeback victory in the history of the NFL last week against the Colts.
Well, I will say, I have been to the new stadium, and it's obviously it's an amazing edifice. I was there, honestly, when we got our butts kicked. Maybe a year before. It was a year before I got fired, I think. And they had it going on. I mean, to Rick Spielman's credit then, I know there's a lot, gone on since then, but they would come hard. Everything about them and the fan base, they were so proud. What's the horn called? Did you call it a horn? Whatever.
The Gallahorn? Yeah. There, as you could maybe tell, I don't know. I've kind of knocked the Minnesota accent completely out since I became like kind of a person who is, moved on in my life as far as I've moved out of the state and even further out of the state and eventually further away as you know. But I'm very like Norwegian and like the Gallahorn, the Lefse, like all that stuff. And then, the skull chant that they have now, like it's very like loud and proud Minnesota there. And I'm excited to see them play. And I think, one of the interesting things about that franchise, which is what we're going to talk about today, is, going all the way back, we talked about edge players last Monday, that franchise, you've had, Carl Eller and Jim Marshall and Chris Dolman and John Randall and like Everson Griffin, Jared Allen, Donnell Hunter. And then they've also had like Alan Page, interior defensive lineman, who was also a Minnesota Supreme Court justice. You have Keith Millard, you have Henry Thomas. And back when you played them, you had, Linval Joseph and guys like that. They've built that defensive line in Minnesota almost the entire time. And we're going to talk today about interior defensive linemen and, what goes into evaluation. But you brought up a really good point when we were off air about it's more than just evaluating the players, right? Because unlike edge player, where it's really about like pinning your ears back and getting after the quarterback and being sturdy against the run and setting an edge, interior defensive lineman has a lot of nuance to it, doesn't it?
It has a lot of nuance. And I know we do all agree, everyone in the world, you build from the inside out. I understand that. And yet you need, when you're going after an interior defensive lineman, And it's a guy, again, one of my favorites ever. I mean, I love, love, love watching Aaron Donald. Everything he does is like the prototypical, exactly what you're looking for inside against the run. He can move along. He can be a 1 technique, a 3 technique, a 5 technique. You can also move him out to a 9 technique, which is some of the things we'll talk about, right? When we are evaluating D linemen, what is their versatility, those interior D linemen? When you have a special guy like that, it's amazing to see his versatility and how he can just jump into many different areas. So what I would say, however, though, there is also something to consider when you are drafting or when you are acquiring a big time interior defensive lineman. It's, to me, and I'd love to hear from your perspective, it is really, really important to factor in how many plays do you foresee that player playing for you. I got into this a little with Dan Quinn. And again, as you guys all know, I love Dan. He and I are really close, but we would banter a little bit about, he would say, we need a stud in here. And I would say, okay, I get it. But can we go out and get a better value stud for inside if he's only going to be playing 30 plays in a game, or 30, or let's just call it 35%? If we're going to invest big time money, multiple year contract, or if we're going to invest a full-time early round pick, and we're only going to be playing him 30-something% because he's more of a 2-gap guy, and he's not really getting the pass rush that you want, but he plays the run really well, which is some of the things we'll be talking about tonight. It is a really interesting conversation between coaches and personnel, man, quite often when it comes to value.
Well, and I know we saw that this year with Jordan Davis out of Georgia, right? Because there's a lot to it, right? And I think you have to, when you draft these players, they have to be a part of a broader understanding of the game, right? So about 2 years ago at PFF, I wrote an article basically saying interior defensive linemen matter and it was more about the run stuffers, right? Because I showed that, when you have an interior defensive lineman who is good, and we'll talk about how to measure goodness, right? When you have an interior defensive lineman who's good and he can eat blockers on early downs, it allows you to play fewer men in the box on early downs, right? Which I think, by the way, backing up, a lot of teams are doing that more now. And what you're seeing is 4.5 yards per carry, which is an historic value, right? Everybody wants to play the 2 high stuff. Everybody wants to invite the run. And if you have a nose tackle that can eat that space, then on average, you play worse 2nd and 3rd down game scripts, right? Because you get, obviously you get run stops. And so that guy, even though he's only playing 1st and 2nd down, he does impact the passing game because every pass you go up against is in a 3rd and 8 or 3rd and 7 or on average. And so it does influence it, but you have that has to be part of your understanding. You can't just have a space eater guy and then also play 8 guys in the box, right? So like you have to, if you're going to have a big guy like that, you have to have like smaller safeties and you have to play them deeper. It has to be part of a coherent plan. And I just don't know necessarily if everybody's willing to do that. Now the Eagles took Davis, right? They traded up for him, took him at 13, and they do that. They play back. And the problem is, of course, is when he gets injured, then they're bad against the run because, you're fragile to having that particular type of player play defensive line for you. It's such an interesting discussion because, again, like, what if we broke this discussion up into 2 types of players, right? So I consider like kind of 2 types of defensive linemen. I think of like penetrators, right? Guys that get upfield and they get to the passer, they're disruptive against the run. But for the most part, they're making life miserable on the offense in the passing game. And then I also think of like space eater guys. So guys that stop the run, and if they get to the quarterback on the way out, basically that's a plus. And I think you have to split it into 2 categories. And I think for the most part, NFL teams, they really value the first guy. If you look at like salaries and draft position, and maybe with the signing or the drafting of Jordan Davis, they're starting to like the second guy.
Well, you have a lot there. We were talking a little bit about nose tackle before we go to what we often refer to as a 1-gap player and a 2-gap player, right? That 2-gap guy, just to lead in on that, is that guy is going to hold the point and can play both sides, right? So he can hold the point and play both gaps versus a 1-gap player who's going to shoot. You have a guy, look, back to Aaron Donald, you're going to call him one of the best 1-gap players ever, but he's got such strength and awareness to play 2 gaps too. He's just that special, that's sort of special situation. Let's go back first to the 2-gap. Let's go back to that space eater guy that you're talking about. Let's Let me go back quickly to Vince Wilfork back in the days in New England, right? And, he was one of those guys. And I know that Bill Belichick had such an understanding of that interior D-line. So did Scott Pioli, because they were pairing together strongly then. And they both, Scott, by the way, he was a college D lineman. So at the core, any of us normally, you love tight ends, and Scott loves D tackles, and he'll always love them. And
when Scott's last first round pick in Kansas City was a damn good player in who was the defensive lineman for the Chiefs. I'm blanking on him. The guy from Memphis, Dontari Poe. Very good player.
Right. And we would have loved to have had him in Atlanta, for sure. But so back to that, just to stay on this tangent, I think that interior D lineman, the two gap guy who is playing the run, right? Remember this. Let's get a little bit into evaluation first, and we can mix it in. It's the same thing. Remember, everyone, I said snap the whistle when we are evaluating. So think about that. And with D linemen, we're looking at how they play against the run and how they play against the pass. And whenever we presented our reports coming up as a scout, we would present that to the decision makers and the GMs. They wanted to hear what we had to say, how they played against the run, how they played against the pass. Start with the run. When you're talking about a space guy, right? When you're talking about that two gap guy, we're tried and true. We are about lateral leverage, right, Eric? We want to know that cat in there can hold the point and he doesn't get washed. If you get washed, I don't care how big and fat you may be, and I say that respectfully to that position, you think you can hold it. But if you get washed and you don't have lateral leverage, you have no chance to be the run stop person that you need to be and potentially make quite a bit of money doing that, right? Normally, those two gap guys, we'll stay here and I want to toss it back to you. Those two gap guys, they're not rushing the passer, but for collapsing the pocket again, back to just jamming those guys back and getting under the pads with some of those guys where they're, the offensive linemen are back on their heels. That is really, really important when we're talking about, again, when we're talking about run, you're talking about the ability to use your hands. One last thing before we go over to you, that idea of having that interior guy, nose tackles through and through. I never knew this many years ago. That is the most toughest mentally and physical position on the field. Everyone's coming at you. And I used to think, well, they're just kind of holding it. That's a tough ass place to be hanging out, right? So it's an interesting.
Yeah, and that was, and I bring up Dontari Poe for that reason, right? Because the big thing for him was, that 2013 Chiefs defense that, held they were 9-0. They held all the first 9 opponents to 17 points or less, and they were really good. And like one of the big things that this was back when Pro Football Focus was first on, they were doing snap counts, which, it's funny to say now, but back then that was one of the first places to do it. Like he was playing every down. And, there's a great deal of, that's one of the difficulties there, right? Because if you can play every single snap, as the league has evolved, and again, this is where I'm kind of looking at this as when I'm trying to evaluate these guys, like I'll look at a few things, right? So if you make a tackle, with a success rate of 0, right? Or a successful play of 0, which is basically, you think about success rate, the broadest category, which is, this is not correct, but it does a decent job of approximating. You get 4 or fewer yards on first down, less than half of the available yards on second down, and short of the first down on third and fourth down. If you can get stops in the run game, that's one of the more correlated variables year to year for a defensive lineman, like one of the most correlated variables in all of football. So if you can tackle the running back as a defensive player, that is one of the most linebacker level, defensive line level. So that's something I look at. But also there's the part of like, do you cause perfectly blocked runs? And what I mean by perfectly blocked runs is, when you look at the offensive side of the ball, if there are no negatively graded blocks on an offense, the ball carrier, like it adds up a half a point to the offensive efficiency. Meaning if none of the linemen lose, it's the best play in football is run, right? So if you can cause a negatively blocked play, whether or not you make the tackle or not, right? If you just get penetration or you hold up a double team or you do something of that nature, it causes, much like on the other side of the ball, the running back is so much better when everything's blocked ahead of him, of course. The linebackers behind you are so much better when things in front of you are fail, right? And before, like I think of back to your time with New England, when 60 to 70% of the downs, you're in an odd front with 3 defensive linemen, 2 middle linebackers, and 2 edge guys. your opportunity to cause a negatively blocked play as a defensive lineman were higher because your chance of taking on a double team were lower. But like what's impressive about some of these guys now that play is you're mostly, and I remember this vividly because I sat back there and watched Le'Veon Bell run for 170 on the Chiefs in a playoff game. You're a lot of times, because you're trying to minimize wide receiver play, you have 2 down linemen, 2 edge players, 2 linebackers. One of those linebackers might be a safety. And then you're playing 5 behind, right? Or 6 behind even. And your job as a defensive lineman is so much harder in those situations because you're always taking on a double team. And the guy behind you, if he's a strong safety masquerading as a linebacker, he can't get anybody in his kitchen at all because he's not built for that, the way that the Bart Scotts of the worlds and the Teddy Bruschi's of the worlds were back in the day. So I feel like mathematically what you do when you look at that data is you do have to look whether you use tracking data or StatsBomb is doing this really cool thing where they're talking about using tracking data to measure engagement. So like how much do you move? Like this is a tracking data problem for all the analysts out here. But like if you're engaged, from engagement do you move forward or backward? That would be a great measure. I would imagine it'd be very stable for defensive linemen. But like even just like play-by-play stuff, does the guy in front of you win when you are double teamed, or does the guy in front of you win when you have 2 down linemen instead of 3 down linemen instead of 4? Like all those things are very stable metrics for defensive linemen. And when I'm looking at measuring a guy from college to pro, obviously tackles are good, stops are good, but really what it is can you hold the point of attack? Because if you can, then everybody on your team's going to look a lot better. That 3rd round linebacker is going to look like a 2nd round linebacker in front of you. And obviously all those defensive backs are going to look a lot better because their 3rd downs are 3rd and 8 instead of 3rd and 3.
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about that interior big stud, holding the point, and like you said, 2 gapping. And we love doing it. We love looking at them. They're not the most, starry eye generating people, meaning like, you're not like, wow, look at that athleticism. But it is tried and true, a very, very important part of your defense. And then when you flip over to, and you flip over to the one gap guy, you flip over to the people that catch your eye like that off the mark, the people that no offensive lineman can reach, right? I'm not only talking about the Aaron Donalds, but I'm talking about any of some of those special guys. Look, we drafted Grady Jarrett, 5th round or whatever. I mean, Grady was a really good acquire for us. And it's funny, back to when I talk about values, right? When I think we got Grady Jarrett where we got him, and we didn't have to go up in the top, round or the top 20 of a draft, and we could continue to be mindful of how we put together our interior D linemen. That's something I always kind of, I always had on my mind, so that when our coaches would knock on the door and say, I want you to take this guy at the 15th or 14th pick, my experience was more like, I got it, guys, but let's see what else is there and see how we can put this entire draft together. So let's go back to that one gap guy. Let's go back to the guy who's, again, back to explosion off the ball, beating the O lineman off the ball, where an O lineman tries to shoot his hands, and there's such quickness and hand fighting and ability to play off the hands and not be reached consistently. All of a sudden that guy in the run game is disrupting behind the line of scrimmage, to your point, right? Which is very, very important when we talk about, the analysis behind the line of scrimmage. One of the things I do want to add in all this, let's stay there with the run before we go any further, is we as personnel evaluators and talent evaluators, we can have our analytics set up beside us, right? And we can be watching our video, and we can be saying, okay, these are interesting numbers here. This is great. Too often we get so caught up in the visual side of it. How quick and explosive was he off the mark? How was he bending? How much body control did he truly have to make the plays? And we could say, like, look, he can have all these stats or not have these stats. For instance, let's just say this really athletic guy who's just beating everyone off the ball, but not really acquiring all these big time, stats that are in his favor. And we're still really enamored with the movement of this player and the upside. This is where projections come into our minds at times, which I find are interesting because you can flip it around. You can get back to what I said last week, right, Eric? You can get the ugly plodder inside as a D tackle who's still supposed to be a one gapper, but he plods and he's stiff. He makes some plays, but his numbers might shine more than that really pretty looking guy. Mm-hmm. That becomes a little bit of a quandary when you start talking about who has more upside.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think like that's one of the things, and I know you're very fond of this, and obviously, yeah, they do it publicly at PFF. I know there are teams that do it privately in their own building, but that's why charting and analytics, I think, can help, because obviously if a guy's not going to get a ton of sacks, like we're not going to look at him as readily, right? And obviously the aspect of analytics, I think, in a lot of times in player evaluation, is for somebody like me to go to your desk and say, look, this guy's popping out here. He has all the measurables, right? He's big, tall. Like I think of like a DeForest Buckner, right? Like holy buckets, the guy's 6'6", too. I mean, I stood next, I was on the Colts sideline a couple months ago. I'm standing next to DeForest Buckner. I'm like, okay, that we're just different people here, right? Like I played football. This guy plays football, right? Like and he's just a massive human, and he has the quickness, and he has, obviously he has everything that you want, but then is he productive? And I think that we're really good as evaluators, NFL wise. I say we, but like the whole industry is really good at identifying players who look like that, but identifying players who can play like that is the job of both analytics and scouting. And for me, it like you gotta, the PFF has something called blocks beaten, right? The current big data bowl, which by the, Michael Lopez puts on with the NFL, that's wonderful right now. They're looking at offensive and defensive line play. So this is right down that alley. Like one of the things I studied when I was using tracking data at Pro Football Focus was how much ground did he cover on true passing down. So, it's a play where you're maybe getting to play the 5 tech and you get a one-on-one with a guard or tackle. How much penetration do you get? How fast do you get? And you wouldn't be surprised that the guys like Aaron Donald, Chris Jones, they're all the guys that move the quickest in the first 2 seconds of the play. They might not, their pressure rates might oscillate. Like I know Aaron Donald one year had like 8 sacks, and then the next year he gets 19, right? But every single year he's probably pushing the pocket the similar amount. It just depends upon what quarterbacks you get to play and stuff. It's the job of analytics for somebody like me to go into somebody like your office and say, look, I know he doesn't have the sack numbers, like Grady Jarrett maybe. Like I know he doesn't have the sack numbers in college, but my goodness, is he pushing the pocket? And we can do something with this player if we ever got him in our building. I think that that's reasonable. I want to ask you a question further, though, because we talk about coaching, right? Talk to me about a player, and this has obviously got to be a later round player, I think, for the risk. But tell me about a player who has the measurables, right? So he's big and tall and fast, that isn't productive in college. Even at, like I think of like a guy like Danielle Hunter, right? But he's more of an edge. But think about like that kind of version. What if the guy's not productive and the measurements don't look good? Is there ever a time when you as a scout or in tandem with a coach, like your defensive line coach, look at the guy and say, I can work with that? And does that generally work, or is that more often than not fool's gold?
No, it's not. It's not always fool's gold. There are some really interesting ideas to go out with your have your scouts go out with your coaches, right? Your position coaches, and sort of tag team a little bit on some of these guys that you think there's something about that player. It could be natural athleticism, explosiveness that he just has, that is separating him from what you might even deem that we have or you have on your respective team. You take your D-line coach out there and you really work the kid out, right? This is where, just so everyone knows, this is where in the spring, not only are you going to pro days, the big time pro days, of course, and following up after the combine, and you have a pretty good idea most places, but there's usually this group of, I don't know, at each position, you might have 5 or 10 guys that as a staff, you really drill down, and you're excited about going out as a personnel man with your defensive line coach. And again, it could be an area scout, it could be even a director at times, and you start working these guys out and you see this upside, and it's a pure projection, right? It's a pure projection, but you get a chance to see someone and you start digging in, Eric, and you're thinking there is more to this. They might've been playing a funky scheme wherever they were. It might've been a Division II team or some down the line team that just was not thriving for many, many reasons. And that's part of your scouts business, to make sure that they're researching properly. It could be called the way it is. I know when I really pressed our scouts to go out and know the coaching staffs, and so that they could come back to me and say, Thomas, player A here, he does not have the stats that would warrant us drafting him. That said, their D-line coach is horse crap. He is not worth a damn as far as a coach. He's out fiddling around and doing nothing that will help develop this player. And if he had the proper coach developing and the track record to develop, this coach does not. He has no track record. He's been there because he's a loyal myrmidon of the head coach. And so I love that. When we got information like that, we started piecing it all together.
Yeah.
And then we started taking the stats that he did in fact have and looking at the numbers and started realizing, like, wait, maybe there is something. So and those are fun. Those are what you asked me a few episodes ago. Would you rather, go out and scout that really stud all-star guy or the down the line, or that's the diamond in the rough? Those are where the diamond in the roughs are nice when you're kind of playing sleuth and you start putting these things together. You and your D-line coach are high-fiving each other after the workout, and you're thinking, my God, I think we have someone here. We can maybe get him in the 7th round or even as a PFA.
Yeah, that's to me, that's where, like, would you agree that that's where the marriage of analytics and traditional scouting can win? Because I feel like all the top guys, everybody believes all the top guys are good, right? Like, and interior defensive lineman's a little bit tougher, right? Because as we talked about earlier, it's harder. The closer you are to the football, the harder it is to acclimate from college to pro in the NFL. So there's the development aspect, and there's the can he play right away. One of the guys I want to talk about in tonight's game, and I'm not going to give it up right away, but this Devontae Wyatt from Green Bay, from Georgia. The Packers needed him to kind of be good right away. And unfortunately, like, it's going to look like he needs a little bit of development. Like, I think that's a tricky part. But beyond that, right, you're looking at the Grady Jarrett. Like, Grady Jarrett got you a surplus for 4 years that is other than like Dak Prescott and like some of the later round quarterbacks. Like, you're not going to find a better surplus value than what Grady Jarrett offered you guys. And if you can find a player or two like that every couple years at different levels of your defense, like, that's how you win, right? And I feel like, when you can find a player that the market thinks has a defect and you can measure everything else and say this is going to overcome that defect. And again, me as an analytics person, I immediately go to the tracking data. I immediately go to the play-by-play data and I say, okay, this guy, so we talked about last week and how to project. Like, for me, I might look at, okay, can this guy be a situational guy inside, right? Can this guy play on the edge, right? We've seen really good defensive linemen in the league, whether it be J.J. Watt early playing 3 tech, now playing more of a 7 tech on late downs. We saw Donald does that a little bit. They switched the scheme from the 4-3 to the 3-4 for him to play closer to the tackles. And now you see even Chris Jones, the Chiefs defensive tackle, who's having his best season. He's playing out on the edge on late downs because they have some guys who can play inside. Like, if I can see something like that in his data, which is just like, look, he's had success at 5 tech, he's had success at 1 tech, he's had success even as a 7 tech or 9 tech, like all this stuff, I'm really going to look at that and say, okay, there's more ways to win with this player. And that's really kind of what you're also looking for, right, Thomas, is with a guy who's later on in the draft, the more ways you can win with a player, and this is going to be true about every position, but I think especially along the defensive line, the more ways you can win with a player, the better.
Yeah, and we talk about it all the time. And versatility, mentioned it earlier. We'll always talk about it. I talk about versatility not only here, but I talk about it in SumerSports when I'm talking about Sean Clement. Let's give Sean his props. Sean Clement, I think, is a stud in our business. Those of you in the data side who know Sean Clement, his versatility to dabble in so many different things, like you, it is a big time boon for a company that has them or a team that brings them on, because they have the ability, again, versatility. That's my little pump there for Sean. But
yeah,
yes, no question, versatility in life in general. I think it's a big thing. Can I do this before we move on? I know we want to talk about the game a little bit, but I think this is good because I love humbling myself to this group, and the more I feel like I'm bonding with our listeners and our base or whatever. So look back to 2009. So the year after I got hired in Atlanta, after 8 with Matt Ryan and everything we did, and we brought in Michael Turner, and then the next year we brought in 9 we traded for Tony Gonzalez. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we were trying to figure out, and I remember asking Mike Smith, the head coach at the time, and this is a learning lesson for everyone. So I raised my hand in these situations where mistakes were made, because I love being able to share with people. It's not an ego thing, because we all have them. This is not an exact science. We were so gung-ho. I remember sitting down with Mike Smith, and I said, Smitty, We did all we did last year, and we're really proud of that 2008 draft. And we had a really nice season coming off of a really bad situation after the Michael Vick debacle and everything in Atlanta. What do you need, Coach? What truly do we need in this team? He's a D-line coach by trade, right? He's a linebacker guy, and Smitty is a tough-ass guy. I love them, still love him. And he said, we need an interior guy. We need a guy who's going to disrupt inside. Okay, we really, really honed in. We had a few people we were looking at. We didn't know which way we're going to go. I talked about it a couple episodes ago. Who do we pass up when we passed up Clay Matthews for Pere Jerry. And I want to bring up Pere Jerry because I think it's a really good discussion for a minute here. Pere Jerry out of Mississippi, really, really athletic. Most people in the league had high grades on him coming out because of everything that he offered. Again, from athleticism to ability to explode, to disrupt behind the line of scrimmage, pass rush, and pursue across the field. You would see this cat bursting across the field, making plays from sideline to sideline, scraping like a linebacker. We thought we had our guy, right? We were going to build years and years. Here's what we didn't do. And this is where I could have used you back then. There were so many things out there about Pere that just unfortunately weren't right. Unfortunately, he blew his knee the first year in, right? And he never was the same. And we did not acquire the right player there. But there were elements to him that if we really would have dug down and looked beyond this unbelievable eye-catching explosiveness, playmaking ability that he could, that he had, and everyone was talking about him, to he was older, he had an injury history, his work ethic was fairly suspect, and there were two or three other things that I won't talk about here right now that we cast out aside because, once again, need drove us to an interior D lineman who was going to tear it up. We thought he was going to be like an Aaron Donald. He wasn't. He was a mistake. A really, really interesting storyline.
Yeah, I mean, and it's what I love so much about this podcast is, like, I think we're both here, we talk about our hits and our misses. And, like, I think that one, you look back, and I think what, for the people that are listening to the show who are in that chair now, or people who are going to be in that chair, I think what is the tough part is knowing that, like, it's sort of like if you came to me and said, Eric, and I, we don't gamble at SumerSports, but you said, hey, Eric, you only have 4 bets the rest of your life, right? You're going to make some weird decisions, right? I'd like to be able to say to somebody in that chair, you win some, you lose some, right? And you learn from the loss, you learn from the mistakes that you make. But you don't always get that. Now you were successful twice. I mean, you had two great stints. So you had some time to make good picks and learn from the bad picks. I think, the ultimate thing is, and what we hope this podcast is going to be for people who want to listen for that is, the best thing that somebody could do is learn from, you being, honest and raw about the times that you've had. Right. And here's a question I have for that particular pick too, did you draft him? Were you too willing to draft him because he fit scheme, or was one of the reasons he didn't make it additionally because he didn't fit scheme? What was the scheme fit thing? Because that's the thing for me that I'm always a little bit questionable. What is, do teams overzealously draft players who don't quite fit their scheme, and that's one of the reasons they don't have a success? Or do they fit the scheme perfectly, but they're not that good of a player? And, like, I think that is two places where people can fall into, well, I mean, I'm not even saying mistakes can be made, because sometimes you just take a player and it doesn't work, and that's usually how it goes. But, like, is there like, which one of those two happen more often?
Okay, so we could talk about this forever, and we could talk about it here. We could talk it at a bar over a bottle of wine or two or whatever. We could sit around with many people. I think it's a fascinating conversation. What everyone needs to know, normally in a situation like that, we drafted for our scheme. And our scheme was 4-3. It was fly around. It wasn't fly around as much as Dan Quinn was when Dan came from Seattle, of course. But Mike Smith and his group, Brian Van Gorder, we wanted to be tough asses. We wanted to be up in people's faces, an explosion upon contact, left, right, and center, right? We go after a guy like Pere Jerry. And by the way, Pere Jerry, I was cheering for him. I liked Pere. It's just, unfortunately, he has his injury, and then he tails off, of course. When I look back on this, though, I got frustrated with him because I thought, you are too good to not be making the plays that we expect you to make. And this comes back to expectations. It comes back to need. It comes back to scheme. All of a sudden, you're sitting there again, thinking you're going to build a bomber defense. And remember, everyone, ideally in the NFL, we want a stud right there in the middle of that defensive line. We want a badass linebacker who can take it and roll with it. And then we want maybe a safety. I liked the different layers in a defense that could just light it up. And we thought we were doing that in this situation, and not to go off and protract here, but I really believe we thought we had the right scheme. Remember this too, though, as you start moving through your time with a player, there may be changes in scheme. We had it, believe me. And then you invest money in certain people, you renew contracts, and then you look like a dumbass to someone else, and people are like, what happened? Why would they do that? Well, we changed the scheme on the fly. We went from a 4-3 to a 3-4, and we had a new D coordinator who didn't really like the guy, right? There are so many layers to this. Yeah. And the last thing I want to say on this, back to acquiring talent, whether it's in free agency or the draft, everyone needs to know, if you're a good GM, you need to listen to your coaching staff too. You can't be that guy who just slams his fist on the table. It does not work in this league. It maybe worked 40 years ago. It doesn't work now. You have to be a listener as well. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, of course.
Yeah, I've heard so many times, when I ask, like, hey, I ask people in the league, I'm like, why didn't you guys take so-and-so? And it's just like, the coach wasn't comfortable with him. And I honestly, I can appreciate that to some degree, right? Like we always, and I think this is also to the point of, it's hard not to root for your predictions, right? And so every time you make a draft pick as a general manager, you're rooting for your prediction. Every time you're a content creator and you go out and say, I really like, so last night I watched the game, and I got to be honest with you, I love what Jahan Dotson did, but that's also because I wanted Jahan Dotson, like as a Kansas City Chiefs fan, I wanted the Chiefs to get Dotson so badly. I think he's really good, but then I'm out there cheering for my prediction the whole time, right? Like, and that of course is fine if you're just, watching football and enjoying it. But as an evaluator, I think the hardest part is you don't want to root for your predictions so much that you make additional mistakes, right? Like if you take a guy and you're like, okay, this guy's an Aaron Donald type, right? And then he comes in and he ends up being more of a 5 out of 10. Well, 5 out of 10s on a rookie contract can still give you a surplus value. It's not as good, and it's not as, this is my Baker Mayfield rant. It's like Baker Mayfield's not a franchise quarterback, but on a rookie deal, he's a better value sometimes than a guy making $40 million. And like that, of course, is an extreme example, but like what you want to be able to do as an evaluator, say, okay, go to your coach and say, this guy's not working out, right? How can we at least extract some value out of here? Even though the whole time he's not actually going to look, the draft pick's not going to look successful. Like, continue to throw good money at bad, right? If a guy comes in and he's not Aaron Donald and you got to switch him to more of a rotational guy, that every time he's out there, it's going to look bad for your pick, but he's still helping the team win. And like, you still got to be able to do that. Is that that's a tough thing to do?
That's a tough thing to do for sure. I was just sitting there amazed at your doctorate mind doing this magical segue into Baker Mayfield and the game and the Rams and how in the hell he ended up there, of course. But so you've got me off balance.
Yeah, I know we disagree about Mayfield, and I think I think your view of what a number one overall pick quarterback should be is more correct than mine. I'm more of a, okay, what did he produce? What did he cost? Take that difference. If it's positive, whatever. But I understand what you're saying. Like when you draft a quarterback first, and furthermore, if you take a defensive lineman in the top 15, that guy's got to be a great player, right? Like, and even if he's a modestly good player, like, and he's still a positive surplus player, it's hard to swallow. But do you agree though, that like a lot of mistakes in this league are not necessarily the entry point, but they're the additional decisions you make about that player because you want to prove yourself right, or the coaching staff wants to prove themselves right, and ultimately the adjustments you could have made to salvage some value out of that pick don't often get made?
Yeah, it's a great point. There are a lot of elements to that conversation as well. And, I think true natural, a builder psyche is, I want to continue to work with this guy. I know that he has more than we're getting, we're getting out of him. And they can get pretty darn what's stubborn over it for sure on both sides, not only as a GM, but also as a coach. Or flip it around, brother. This is a big thing for everyone to know. Sometimes when we pass up people in the draft and people are pulling their hair out from our respective teams, like, what's this guy thinking? If you have a coaching staff that does not believe in that guy, I don't care what eye you have as an evaluator. You're and this happens, believe me, it's happened to me before. Your entire scouting staff is on the edge of their seats, like, you're going to draft this guy, right, T? And I'm thinking, we have 3 coaches on our staff who are vehemently opposed to this person. And we could prove them wrong, yes. But if it's that opposed, that's not a good thing. All of a sudden, that guy walks into your building and you don't have your guys developing the way you want. It's a rough road.
Wait, how do you prove them wrong when they might have an incentive to not play? Like, I mean, and again, this goes back, and we've talked a lot. I want to, when we kind of wrap this whole thing up in like 2 months with all the positions, I kind of do want to talk to you about, what I consider to be kind of a, they have job descriptions for players, which the coach and GM agree on. Like, I feel like that's something where I think, that gets around the whole, like, well, I'm viewed as a bust as a GM because I drafted this guy, but they didn't play him right. And like, or furthermore, like the coach, the Bill Parcells back in the 90s where he, with the Patriots, where he says, like, if I'm gonna cook, I want to get some of the groceries. Like, there's this tension has existed forever. And I think, the only way to sort of get around it is for guys like us, to talk about it and for it to be more normalized that this exists, and like to obviously go around it. So
can I say that normalized? You're exactly right. No, we're going to touch on it, but these are not, and I used to tell Arthur Blank this, and again, these are not excuses from the general manager or the team builders around the country. They are what they're dealing with. And if you are a good general manager and you know how to navigate properly, there's a time to flex your muscles and there's a time not. There's also a time when you realize, I gave that coach what he wanted. I'm not even talking about the head coach. It could be a position coach. And sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you would step away with your head coach and you would have a conversation. You'd say, let's give position coach A this one, T. Even if you're vehemently opposed to him at a certain level, he likes him. He knows the coordinator they had in college who's his best friend, and they really believe that if you did this, this, and this, you can bring him along. Like, again, everyone needs to know, like, it's not these decisions aren't made in a vacuum, and it's not just that.
Yeah.
And this is where this job, I think, is fascinating. And when you get the really good guys that can hang around a long time and circuitively navigate around the coaching staff and with the coaching staff where appropriate, guys like Howie Roseman, guys like Mickey Loomis, these guys that are, well, Howie's not up to Mickey, but those guys like Mickey and Kevin Colbert, who were around a long time, had a really good knack of taking that D lineman, who they wanted, who they needed, but also working in, the interest within their organization to make sure that he's going to thrive.
Yeah, by the way, just an aside before we preview the game, Kevin Colbert drafted Cam Hayward, who is not only, for my money, a top 3 defensive interior player in the whole league, but also I interviewed him on my old podcast when I was at PFF at the Super Bowl. Honest to God, the nicest football player I've ever met in my life. Just a truly, like, I don't know if it's like this for you, but when somebody like who is that good at what they do, like, asks you how your day is and like, hey, where'd you travel from? Like, Cam Hayward was, honest to goodness, the kindest dude I've ever, like, I every time I watch him play, I'm so like happy that he's also a good person, but he, is obviously a 10 for 10 as a football player as well. So, and Colbert, obviously draft him, and Omar Khan now takes over there, good continuity in Pittsburgh. So let's preview. We only have like 5 or 6 more minutes left, but let's preview tonight's game. This is interesting, right? I always think back, like, 2 years ago, this was an NFC divisional round playoff game. Last year, obviously, these were the 1 seed in the AFC as well as, the NFC and the Super Bowl, winner, but also the team representing there. But now both teams basically need to win out to make the playoffs. The Rams go to Green Bay. It's a little cold. Total's under 40. The Rams are now 7.5-point underdogs in this game. Baker Mayfield probably starting for the Rams, I would imagine. After last week, he will. In this situation, you have 2 teams kind of drawing dead all year, but still motivated because the NFC is so weak that both teams could make it if they win out. Thomas, what do you think? What do you think about this one?
So as I normally do, I'm going to step back and I'm just going to look at the executives in charge first, right? Let me lead in there. Yeah, Brian Gutekunst's on one end, and you have Les Snead, right? Les F them picks, Les, my close buddy, and Brian, who I have respect for as a team builder. They're both in really interesting spots here. Before we get into the what I think is going to happen, I think I thought I believe, didn't I just read that Green Bay has a 7% chance of making it, and really, I don't even think the Rams do they? I think that's.
I think they might have been eliminated already. I think with Detroit getting up to, I want to say that one of the publications had the Rams at least with like a small chance, but yeah, for all intents and purposes, the Rams are basically out of it. But the Green Bay, very much, let me look at make playoffs. Our friends at Pro Football Focus, basically no chance for the Rams. They might already be eliminated. I have not followed that as closely as I've followed the teams like Detroit and Green Bay. But Green Bay, basically, they have a game against Detroit week 18 at home that could decide it. They basically have to win out and get help. Brian Gutekunst, by the way, went to University of Wisconsin lacrosse, is where I taught before I went into football. So I always will root for him a little bit. But yeah, they're at a crossroads in their situation too, right? Because coming off a bye, they had a win against the Bears 2 weeks ago. Long rest kind of has made us forget a little bit about how poor Green Bay has been this year, right? Because they have a hard time stopping the run. Yeah, the historical Sunday night effort against Philly. This brings up my player to watch, which is Devontae Wyatt. I said this before. Late round, first round pick out of Georgia. A little old, 24 years old, right? I think one of the things Green Bay wanted to do was draft him and Quay Walker out of a great defense. But Thomas, when you take a player out of a defense like Georgia, do you ever get concerned that like that's a defense with 5 first-rounders on or 6 first-rounders on it? Do you ever get concerned that like, is that guy's production his or is it the defense's? Because I feel like right now in Green Bay, he can't really get on the field. He struggled when he's gotten on the field. They needed him to play well right away, and they need him soon as well because they don't really have a lot of defensive linemen signed in the future. Is that one thing looking backwards that would have concerned you about him in the late first round? Because that defense had, Nakobe Dean, they had, Trayvon Walker, they had Quay Walker, they had, Lewis Seen, all these great players on the defense. Jalen Carter, who's going to be a top 5 pick this year. And like Wyatt was kind of productive for them, but not like the best player on the defense. Do you ever get worried about a prospect like that?
Yeah, I mean, you love going to those programs that are just completely kick-ass programs, right? The Bamas and now Georgia, what they're doing. You think everyone knows how to win. They live it, they breathe it, they bleed it, and you think that you're going to hit on that. That's a really good point. I wouldn't kill myself thinking about that, but It's in the back of my mind. And this goes back to, if you do look at historicals, and I love that. I think looking back on some of the people that would, that you may be thinking about acquiring, whether it's in the draft or free agency, I love looking at the history of that type of a player. Try to find the parallels and see exactly, what has happened, how you can draw. And that's why, I continue to talk to you about that. If you and I were working together in an NFL team, being able to really dig in at layers that are completely advanced, I think might have aired some of this, some of the mistakes that, we've all made along the way. Can I say this before we keep going on the game? Back to these two guys, right? Game related, Les Snead and Brian Gutekunst. These guys right now have a lot on their plate. Their minds are heavy, believe me. When you know that you're almost out of the playoffs, Les is coming off of a Super Bowl, of course. Brian's coming off of some really interesting stuff that happened. Now you're looking at your team and you're like, man, coach, on both sides, we need to figure out who in the F we need to make some changes with. And we need these young guys to start playing. I need to know where we're going. This is a tough conversation. You have a head coach, of course, and so do I as a GM. You want to win as many games as possible, brother. But but I also want to see these 3 guys. Can you work them in tactfully without saying to the fan base that we're throwing these games? Because I am not that. I am a competitor to the very, very end. That said, I think you can be tactful and smart about working some guys and folding them in for some time so you get more of an idea of what you have. We at times didn't do that as well as I would have liked to have done that. And if I were to ever go back, I would say, like, Dan was all about developing our guys, but I think I would have maybe like to push a little bit more with both of the head coaches I was with in those situations, because you need to see what you have going into the next year, because you can be writing some big time checks or not writing checks for people that, you really don't have a true beat on. And it's a really odd situation because you want to win, of course.
Yeah. And that reminds me, your last full year in Atlanta, you guys did finish 6-2 down the stretch. Like you were a good team that year that just kind of had bad luck. Like that's like so hard, right? Because that team that, like, if you're a team that hits on a bad luck, you're a team like, our Detroit Lions 1-6, now they're 7-7. Like you were with Atlanta in 19, like you were a game or two away from kind of doing the exact same thing in 19, where you start, I think 1-7, then you finish 6-2 down the stretch. And the reason that you're a bad luck 1-7 team is because there's good players on your team. Do you really want to sit down Deion Jones? Do you really want to sit down guys who are really or actual players and say, wait till next year? I don't think that. I'm an analytics guy. I'm all about, playing for the good draft pick. And I think if you get to the final week of the year, you should sit guys because, it's one game. But with like 4 games left, I just don't think that these guys are wired that way. I think football is Parcells called it a bad game for well-adjusted men. I think like football players are not wired to turn it off and on that way. And so I think in a game like this, you got to play your guys if they're healthy. Now, if they're not healthy, you got to sit them down. But if they're healthy, you got to play your guys in games like this.
Completely. Think about this now. Here's what we tend to do too much of, and maybe you don't as much as an analytics person. So we're sitting there thinking about this, and we're like, yes, we want to. And then I have a really deep conversation with the head coach a day or two before, and I start suggesting, let's play this guy and this guy. And we sit there and we say, but Thomas, we're about ready to go into free agency here in the next month or two. And the last thing we want is to be coveting someone and courting someone who's like, yeah, I don't really know about that organization. If we're not doing well, they may pop me out of the game, or they may turn their eye on me. Like, these are really fine-tuned.
I'm not getting my incentives in my contract because you're working with people's pocketbooks here, and I think that's a really interesting thing. Like, we got just a couple minutes left because I think we both have to go at the hour. But I want to give. I do think in this game you are going to see the Rams give a pretty decent effort here. If we don't give out betting advice on the show, but I do think like the Rams getting more than a full touchdown, I think is too much. I think McVay is much, much too good of a coach to lay down in a game like this. I think that, without Donald, it's going to be hard, but I think Jalen Ramsey is going to do a number on those Packers young wide receivers. They just cut Sammy Watkins to play the younger guys even more. I do think the Rams make this game competitive. I do think that, the problems that the Packers have had all season on offense and on defense, it's not like they're just going to go away because they're facing a team that's down a little bit in the Rams. So I do think that this is a game where, these Monday night games, they're sometimes, not the greatest games between great teams. I think you're at least going to get a competitive game tonight.
Yeah, I think the same. And again, I think they both are gunning for it. My head's been a lot on what are the next steps for Sean McVay? Like, where is he with everything? Where is his head? What's his relationship like with Les? And I'm in no way trying to project that, but here's a guy that, when you start talking about people out there talking about, would you, this is the time when people start talking about, would you ever trade for a coach? Right. I'm only bringing him up because a guy like that, or there's probably a handful of other guys out there that most teams would think I would give away a lot to get a coach like that. And you have two really interesting young coaches who work together that are going head to head. And instead of me being like everyone else out there and your strong opinions about how the teams are and how they're going to fare out, I don't want to go out on a limb. I'd love to see Les win because I'd love to get another win under his belt. That's nothing against.
And as somebody who has friends and who also has futures on the Detroit Lions making the playoffs, I would like to see a little bit of the wings clipped. I did look this up on 538. If the Rams win out, they have a 0.5% chance of making the playoffs. So they are still technically not mathematically eliminated. But what you did give me is a great idea for the next show, which is I'm going to ask you and you're going to ask me what you would pay in draft picks to trade for a quote coach. And I'm going to try to come with the best mathematical price for one. And you're going to tell me that I'm insane, which is going to be fun. Thomas, this has been a lot of fun. To everybody in the chat, we really appreciate you. Sorry we didn't get to your questions. We will get to your questions on Wednesday. There were a ton of them, including by some listeners to the show, but also some coworkers with us. Today we'll probably we'll wait till next time, but next time will be also a little bit longer show as it is. So we again appreciate you all for coming. Can you do me a favor? Go onto your favorite podcast platform, 5 stars, write us a review. We really would appreciate it. If you put a question in the review, we will read it. I promise. And if you're on YouTube, smash the like button, leave a comment. Thomas and I always take those very, very seriously. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 13 of the SumerSports Show.